Imagine you are an American, sitting on your couch, clicking on a Cold War video. You expect missiles, tanks, maybe grainy footage of parades in Red Square. Instead, the screen opens on a dim stone corridor, the echo of footsteps, and a wooden crucifix on a convent wall. Behind one ordinary door, a family is pressed against the plaster, holding their breath. Outside, a police car crawls past, its headlights cutting across the iron gate. Inside, a nun in a simple habit lays a finger to her lips and whispers, "You're safe here." This is not the Cold War story most of us grew up with, but it is one of the most surprising fronts in that conflict. A secret network of priests, nuns, and lay Catholics who turned monasteries and convents into safe houses and escape corridors under the nose of some of the most powerful security services on Earth. And it's a story where, again and again, communist regimes were forced to admit, often in classified reports, that even with their prisons, their files, and their ideology, they could not fully shut this network down. For an American audience, it's a story that feels familiar and strange at the same time, like watching German officers in World War II realize they are outbuilt and outthought. Only this time, the battlefield is made of chapels, passports, printing presses, and micro-networks of faith. Let's start a little earlier, in a different war, to see how this underground began. During the Second World War, as Nazi power spread across Europe, Catholic convents, monasteries, and schools quietly became hiding places for Jews and other hunted people. In Rome alone, when German forces moved to deport the city's Jewish population in October 1943, Catholic clergy opened the sanctuaries of the Vatican and hundreds of religious houses. By one careful count, around 477 Jews were hidden inside Vatican properties, and more than 4,200 others found shelter in monasteries and convents scattered across the city. In southern France, a single convent sheltered 83 Jewish children in total secrecy, teaching them prayers, changing their names, and moving them whenever the Gestapo came too close. Elsewhere, priests and nuns forged baptism certificates, turned dormitories into secret barracks, and used church networks to move fugitives from house to house. Those wartime rescue operations were not just acts of conscience, they were training grounds. Priests and sisters learned how to use religious buildings as safe houses, how to manipulate paperwork, how to read the patterns of a police state and slip people through the gaps. When the Nazi flags finally came down and the hammer and sickle went up across Eastern Europe, those skills did not disappear. They went underground with the church. After 1945, communist regimes in Eastern Europe decided that religion, especially organized transnational religion like Catholicism, was a threat. They closed monasteries, seized church properties, banned Catholic publications, and arrested bishops, monks, and nuns in mass waves of repression. In Czechoslovakia, for example, the regime launched an anti-monastery campaign around 1950. In 3 phases, nearly all monasteries were shut down. Nearly 8,200 members of religious orders were sentenced to a combined total of roughly 42,700 years in prison or internment camps, and some clergy were even executed. Catholic schools were closed, the papal nuncio was expelled, and priests who continued to serve openly were treated as state employees under strict surveillance, with hundreds pressured or recruited as informers. On paper, this looked like total victory. In reality, it pushed an entire religious world into the shadows. The Vatican responded by authorizing and encouraging an underground church. Secret bishops were consecrated without state permission. Priests continued to celebrate Mass in private apartments and forest clearings. Religious women who could no longer live in official convents moved into small houses in twos and threes, forming hidden communities that quietly kept their vows. From the outside, these looked like ordinary households. Inside, they were micro-monasteries, places where illegal liturgies were celebrated, where banned texts were copied by hand or on hidden typewriters, where fugitives from the state could be hidden for a night or longer. One Jesuit, Tomislav Kolakovich, saw this future even before full communist rule arrived. In wartime Slovakia, he began gathering young Catholics into small cells, prayer and study groups that met in private homes and schools. The movement was called Rodina, or the family, and spread into most major cities in a single year. Members trained each other in underground work, how to conduct secret meetings, how to withstand interrogations, how to keep faith alive when the public church was taken over. The regime eventually imprisoned many of them, but once released in the 1960s, they rebuilt the network. By the mid-1970s, these clandestine cells crisscrossed Slovakia, hosted in private homes, on pilgrimages, and in informally maintained religious houses. They were not just praying, they were creating a parallel infrastructure, places where people and information could move outside the state's control. From the point of view of the secret police, this was deeply unsettling. Official reports described parallel structures that evaded surveillance, comparing the underground church to a networked adversary with many cells and leaders. What Marxist ideology had predicted would fade away, traditional religion, was instead adapting, learning, and quietly organizing under their noses. The same pattern appeared in Western Ukraine. Before the war, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Eastern in rite but united with Rome, was a central part of national and religious life in the region. When the Red Army retook Western Ukraine, Soviet planners decided that a Catholic Church loyal to the Pope could not be tolerated inside their borders. In 1946, a manipulated Synod of Lviv was used to declare the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church dissolved, its faithful ordered to join the state-controlled Russian Orthodox Church. Churches and monasteries were seized, bishops and many priests were arrested, and thousands of believers were pressured to sign declarations cutting ties with Rome. But large numbers of clergy and laity refused. They went underground, forming what came to be known as the Catacomb Church, secret communities that celebrated liturgy in homes, forests, and hidden chapels. By the 1960s and 1970s, underground Catholic structures in Soviet Ukraine included hundreds of priests and more than 1,000 religious women, many technically illegal. They lived and worked in a kind of mobile monasticism. One week, a priest might be sleeping in the back room of a trusted family's apartment. The next week, he might be hidden in a farmhouse that also served as a secret convent, celebrating Mass for villagers at dawn before disappearing again. Soviet authorities knew some of this was happening. Their own records describe religious catacombs, secret seminaries, and clandestine monastic communities scattered in villages and city outskirts. But they could never quite map the whole network. Destroy one node, and two more would appear somewhere else. Now add one more piece to this picture. Where there are secret priests and hidden convents, there are also safe beds, spare clothes, and back doors. These were not just places to pray, they were natural way stations for people the state wanted to arrest. A dissident writer under investigation, a student organizer expelled from university, a lay catechist caught copying forbidden religious materials. For a night or a week, a religious house could absorb them, label them a relative from another town, give them a temporary identity, then quietly send them onward with a new contact and new instructions. Not everyone was heading to the border. Many just needed breathing room, a place to regroup. But some did, in fact, use these networks as the first link in a chain that led out of the Eastern Bloc entirely. If you are used to Cold War stories about Berlin tunnels and forged passports, this might all feel familiar, just with rosaries instead of wire cutters. From the communist side of the mirror, it looked like a slow-motion nightmare. You close monasteries and monastic life reappears in private homes. You jail bishops and new ones are consecrated in someone's kitchen. You track dissidents at work and they vanish for a while into a world of convent guest rooms and parish attics you cannot fully penetrate. For Americans watching from afar, this drama had an added twist. The Vatican and Western Catholic institutions were not just spectators, they were quietly helping. In the late 1940s and 1950s, the Holy See saw communist persecution of Catholics as both a spiritual and a geopolitical problem. Newly opened archives show how Rome collected reports from behind the Iron Curtain about arrests, show trials, and the closure of monasteries, then used its global networks to send aid and to help resettle some of the displaced. Refugees from Eastern Europe were not only sent to camps or secular resettlement programs, some were channeled into explicitly Catholic institutions in the West, where their stories could be preserved and amplified. One striking example is a Catholic university residence in Madrid, founded in 1946 specifically to house students who had fled the new communist regimes of Eastern Europe. Over the next 2 decades, it hosted around 800 students from 20 countries, becoming both a refuge and a training ground for future anti-communist elites. On the surface, it was just a dorm. In reality, it was the far end of a long, mostly invisible chain that began in underground study circles, hidden churches, and priest-run networks inside the Eastern Bloc. That is where the shock comes in. The same quiet shock you see on the faces of German officers in post-war interviews, trying to explain how they underestimated American industrial and scientific power. Communist governments prided themselves on having the most modern ideology, the most rational planning, the most advanced intelligence apparatus. Yet time and again, they ran up against an opponent they could not quite predict. A transnational church that could be at once peasant and intellectual, ancient and technologically savvy, rooted in local parishes and connected to American universities and media. They could close a convent in Slovakia only to see former sisters reopen communal houses that functioned as secret monasteries. They could jail bishops in Ukraine only to watch underground bishops operate from people's homes. They could confiscate printing presses only to see Western organizations flood their countries with smuggled literature printed on state-of-the-art machines. From an American point of view, that combination is both fascinating and oddly familiar. It's the same pattern you see in other theaters of the Cold War. A superpower built on centralized control, slowly realizing that its opponent's strength lies precisely in being decentralized, adaptive, and plugged into a wider technological and cultural ecosystem. In the military sphere, that meant Soviet planners obsessing over American missiles, aircraft, and satellites. In the spiritual and humanitarian sphere, it meant secret police officers writing frustrated memos about priests, Bible smugglers, convents that doubled as safe houses, and refugees who somehow slipped through the Iron Curtain and turned up on American campuses. When you watch these stories as an American, you are not just seeing pious heroism under dictatorship. You are seeing a kind of soft power battlefield where your own country, its churches, universities, printing presses, and humanitarian groups played a decisive role, often working in tandem with a 2,000-year-old institution based in Rome. The image of Soviet officers shocked is not a single dramatic moment. It is the accumulated realization spread across thousands of documents and decisions that no matter how many monasteries they shut, no matter how many priests they turned into informers, they never quite managed to dominate the one terrain that mattered most to the underground church: the human conscience. And in a Cold War that was ultimately decided as much in hearts and minds as in missile silos, That mattered. So the next time you picture the Cold War, don't just think of missiles and spy planes. Picture a border guard in the 1970s waving through a beat-up Western car, unaware that its hidden compartments are packed with Bibles destined for a secret convent library. Picture a young Eastern European refugee stepping off a train in Madrid, carrying a suitcase and a scholarship to a Catholic residence hall funded as part of a broader Western strategy. Picture a Soviet officer reading yet another report about illegal religious gatherings in private houses and realizing with a mix of anger and disbelief that this old faith keeps reappearing in new forms they never anticipated. And then picture yourself, decades later, watching all of this on a screen in your living room, realizing that the same country that built bombers and computers also helped arm priests and nuns with printing presses, safe houses, and global platforms for their stories. Realizing that, in a very real sense, one of the most advanced weapons in the Cold War was not just a missile or a satellite, but a tiny underground chapel, a doctored van full of books, and a convent door that, when knocked, quietly opened.